Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. We're talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today, I'm joined by the most excellent Zoë Regent. Zoë, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
We've sort of been in each other's orbit for a few years, but we've never met. We have met. We had one call before we recorded this episode. But, we've got some mutual friends and we've got some kind of, I would say, professional proximity. And I've been sort of making eyes at Andus for several years, kind of lurking behind a web browser, admiring what you guys are doing. Before you tell us what's happening in the Andus universe, give us a sense of your journey so far. What were you doing before you arrived at Andus?
Sure. So I graduated back in 2004 and I graduated with a real passion for history. So my first career move was to go to Sky and work for the History Channel. And I was there for 4 years. And during that period, I made the move into innovation. So it was a time when Sky TV were kind of entering the video on demand world, which was the height of innovation back in 2004. So I led the new media team, which started launching that platform for some of the channels. And then I took a break in my mid-20s to travel. And when I came back from traveling, I wanted to work in innovation. Still, I wanted to pursue that route. So I did some consulting at an amazing agency called What If, which is now part of Accenture, and I was there for a few years. And then I thought to become better at the consulting side, I should get some client-side experience to help me build empathy for how it actually feels to deliver innovation. So I went to Cancer Research UK, and I had an amazing 5.5 years there. I started as a senior manager, and by the time I left, I was their head of innovation. And then I spent a couple of years at Save the Children as their innovation director, and then in 2020, I went back to consulting and joined the brilliant Andus, and I've been there ever since.
After a couple of years kind of in that NGO world, what was it that kind of attracted you back? I guess there's two parts to this question, really. There's the question about Andus, what you're trying to get done in the world, and kind of what drives you as a business. But I think the second part of that is, what was it about that transition away back from NGOs into kind of the private sector? What kind of attracted you about the role and helped you make that decision?
Well, I think my experience at Cancer Research UK and Save the Children were really, really different. So Cancer Research UK, because it's inherently a science organisation, like their core purpose is very linked to science, and that makes innovation easier, I think, because it's kind of one of the core beliefs of the whole organisation is that things like experimentation and testing and learning. And the NGO environment is really different to that. I learned loads from being at Save the Children, but I think after being there for a couple of years, to be honest, I thought I'm ready to do something other than fundraising. And the core purpose is less inherently linked to innovation. So I wanted to get a bit more diverse experience. And so I'd had such a positive experience at What If. I was ready to go back to a world where I would be working on innovation challenges for a wider group of organisations rather than just being in-house.
So tell us more about that Andus world, the kind of the work that you're trying to get done, the impact that you want to make. Because if anybody visits your website, you're going to see warmth, bold colours, really grounded human language. Like, you're clearly signaling yourselves as a human-based, a grounded organization that wants to work with people at a very human level. But you're also taking on big innovation projects. You're taking on large clients with big challenges, and you're trying to help them navigate that. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about what Andus is trying to get done in the world?
Sure. So Andus has changed loads in the 4 years that I've been there, actually. When I joined, there were maybe 10 people, and now there's more like 46. And I think the actual ambition and belief has always been the same, which is through changing organizations, you can change the world for the better. You can have a positive impact. And so many organizations are kind of stuck in old ways of working that are restricting their people and not really allowing them to fulfill their potential. I'm a director in the transformation practice, although I do work across strategy and design and innovation, all three areas. But I think what we're trying to do ultimately is to use innovation to kind of kick off this virtuous circle where organizations can learn loads quickly about their ways of working and change what they need to change to make the environment an environment where innovation flows. So better identify blockers, support their talent to develop new skills and become a modern organization, basically.
It's so interesting because, as you know, I'm the founder of Anthem, and we're working in that culture space as well, and wanting to support leaders and organizations to spot what's working for and against them, and then help them take action and do something about it. But one of the things that I've noticed as I've been on this journey is industrial age language that just seems pervasive across organizations. So when you say, we want to help organizations move forward to think differently about the future, to not be stuck in kind of traditional ways of working. I think one of the easiest ways you can spot that is where industrial age language is being used. And guys, we're a long way from the industrial age. Like, the world has changed, and it's amazing how we're still stuck in that kind of vernacular.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think the need for organizations to be really responsive and agile, to speak plainly, is getting more and more increased as the world becomes more complicated and markets change and competitor sets emerge out of nowhere. So the reason that innovation is so beautiful for helping them understand those restrictions is because when you're working on an innovation initiative, it crosses silos. It typically brings together people from across the organization. And when you're trying to do something new, you're pushing at an organization in a new and different way that perhaps you wouldn't normally get. So, yeah, I think that's the best way to learn about what culturally might be holding you back.
I'm glad you mentioned culture, because this is Culture Crush, and we are here to talk about cultures and leadership challenges and what we can do about them. And we're going to get onto that stuff in just a moment. And I know that you've spent a bit of time thinking through those different stops on our journey together. But you mentioned that Andas has grown from, I think you said, from 10 to 46 people since you've been there. Now, I'm just wondering, as the business has grown, and that's incredible growth, by the way. I mean, obviously you guys are connecting in a really exciting way because so many businesses have been struggling the last few years. But I'm wondering, as the business has grown, and specifically as the team have grown, what has surprised you, and what have you found challenging about the team dynamic as that's shifted and changed? Because obviously there are going to be growing pains, right? There are going to be shifts in how you operate as a business. So how have those things been surprising or been challenging?
I think we've learned a lot. We're at a really good number now, and we've grown really steadily, but not everybody who's joined the organization over the past few years has stayed for a long time. Some people have had shorter time with us than others. And I think you get a much stronger sense as time goes on of the type of qualities that you're looking for in people. Now, when we come to hire, there are actually universal characteristics almost that we're looking for in people that we want, as well as skills, which are more behavioral. And I think that's been really useful and really helpful since the hires that we've made over the past kind of 6 to 8 months, I would say. A company is like an organism, isn't it? It's constantly changing, and there's always things going on in the fringes. And I think we're incredibly lucky to be where we are right now with the group of people that we have at the moment, which I think is completely fantastic.
I think it's so interesting to think about how the importance of the character traits and personalities that you are looking for when you're hiring and when you're growing. Because I think that so often businesses focus so much, and again, this might go back to that kind of industrial age idea, but spend so much time thinking about how can we find someone to execute the role, rather than how do we find the right personality who can grow with us, who's going to bring the right energy, who's going to add that contribution to our culture as an organization. And I just think when the business treadmill is moving so quickly, it can be difficult to focus on those things. But actually, if you're only recruiting for the role and just to find someone to get the job done, I think that you're going to bump into cultural challenges further down the line. Because actually, culture is how the best marketing gets done. Culture is how the best stories get made. Culture is how you create financial speed and velocity and agility down the line. Like, if you don't get your culture bit right, you can't have those things in the future. But I can understand that some hiring managers are like, yeah, but I just have an immediate challenge I need to solve right now. Like, I do get that. And I send out my sympathies to hiring managers in that position today. Now, one of the things that we love to talk about on this show is your culture crush. And as you know, it can be a person or an organization. And when we ask this question, your answer isn't endorsing like a whole culture. We know that like every organization has its challenges, but equally, there are going to be most cultures you can look at and say, that is powerful, that connects with me, that is practical, and I can take it and use it. So tell me about your culture crush and why you've chosen them.
I think my answer to this question might be slightly controversial, but I don't buy into anything that's written about culture. As in, there are organizations out there who land their philosophy around culture very articulately, really powerfully. And I know people who work for those organizations, and their lived experience is not what is out there in the literature. So for me, there's two ways of understanding a company's culture, or a proxy for a company's culture. The first one is being in that organization. How does it feel day to day? Or working alongside that organization. So I would say, as consultants, when we're working and partnering with organizations, we get a good sense of their culture because we have firsthand insight and we can see how it plays out day to day. And the second one, which is a proxy, is any organization that puts truly breakthrough original work out into the world. And I think that's a good proxy for culture, because if you can see some really incredible original work, then you know that there's challenge going on in that organization, and you know that somehow those people are doing the best work of their careers. So I would say and there's an agency called Uncommon, which a lot of people and us pull up examples of the work that they do, particularly recently, as being really breakthrough creative. But my culture crush would have to be and us for that reason, because I'm there and I'm living it, and I feel like we are at a really interesting point where we're a small enough organization that there is that sense of possibility. Everyone's going for the same thing. You feel a sense of freedom. We're able to harness the diverse skills and life experience that we have. And it's a really great community. And I think I returned from maternity leave after being out of work for a year in January. And I didn't realize until I was back in the organization how much I'd missed it. And I think it actually is really quite a life-enhancing experience to work there. And I think they're deserving of my my culture crush.
Well, it's absolutely fine. I say to all my guests, look, if your culture crush is honestly where you work, that's absolutely fine. And I thoroughly endorse the honesty and the willingness to say, do you know what is actually where I am? I love that you've selected and us, because it actually speaks to something we've already touched upon. I mentioned before about the language, the colors, the way you're telling stories, through your website, the grounded approach to language that you use, and the way you've brought a lot of humanity to the storyline of the business. And I know that when people come to my website, for example, they'll say, oh, you've got a great website. And I think it can appear easy to do those things. But actually, that choice of language, the way you tell those stories, the positioning, it represents a lot of inner work behind the scenes that people never, ever get to see. And the fact that you're attracting so many people to the business and the business has grown the way it has means that it's resonating with people. And so I love the fact that Andas is your culture crush, and I totally get it. And I totally get the fact that the way the brand is experienced in the world is a reflection of the inner work that's going on behind the scenes. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful choice to have shared with us today. Now, we've kind of touched on some of these themes already. We've talked about surprises and challenges. But I asked you to think about what's a kind of common leadership challenge that you are seeing in the world at the moment. But why don't you take the solution with that question together? So what's the challenge that you see that you want our audience to connect with, be aware of, consider with you? And what's the solution? What's the stuff that you want them to take away, think about, and try?
Sure. So the leadership stroke culture challenge that I have been thinking about a lot recently is that of hybrid working, the conundrum of hybrid working. So I saw a stat the other day, I'm not sure how trustworthy it is, but that about 30% of UK companies are working fully on site today, as opposed to around 60% before the pandemic, which is a huge shift. And whenever I talk to anyone in my network who's a leader at the moment, this is definitely something that they're facing with. And I think it's quite interesting to think about the last few years and how we've got there. So firstly, in the context of the question, thinking about brilliant organizational culture as a culture where innovation flows. And in order for innovation to flow, people have to be in their learning zone. And that's when you get that beautiful sweet spot between challenge and safety. So to have brilliant culture, you've got to have people feeling safe. And to have safety, you have to have trust and strong relationships with the people that you work with. And in my opinion, you can maintain relationships virtually, but it's really difficult to build strong relationships virtually. There's a bit of a tipping point. You need a certain amount of time with people face to face to have that stronger bond that enables you to work remotely and feel like you have a great sense of team. And I think at the beginning of the pandemic, certainly for the first year or so, most organizations were kind of riding the wave of having those strong social bonds, having worked face-to-face with their colleagues for years. But over the past few years, obviously, the makeup of organizations has changed and loads of new people have come in. And I don't think companies have been deliberate enough around what that's going to mean for their working culture. So when lots of people moved out of cities, companies started hiring people who were living further away. So coming into the office was going to be harder. And also at the same time, a lot of organizations are striving for flatter structures, which means that some people's line managers are working on the other side of the UK. And if they're junior, getting that face-to-face time or getting budget to get that face-to-face time is really challenging. And I also think that it can mean that if you're a leader, it can feel quite isolated and lonely because you're not connected to your peers if you are living and working at a different part of the UK. So I think this is a really interesting conundrum. And I know a lot of organizations now are mandating that people come back to the office a certain number of days a week. But I don't actually think that in itself is the answer to the problem either, because I think it's not so much about how much time people are spending face to face in the office. It's about how they're using their time together. So I think the question of how you build and create this dynamic environment, culture of learning in a hybrid environment is one where there isn't a single solution. So thinking about solutions, I think you need to think about it from a number of different angles. Firstly, I think you need to think about the structures and processes of your organization. So rather than making assumptions about why people come to the office or why they don't, you need to think about what you're asking of them. How are you asking them to share information? How are you asking them to update? How are you asking them to work together to build thoughts and ideas? And I think mandating a certain number of days a week in the office is not always the answer, because it's more about when people are together, how are they using their time? So a lot of people that I've spoken to say, we all sit together in the office on a Monday or a Tuesday, but we're all on calls, either with clients or with colleagues who aren't in the office. So I think having experiments around how permissible is it to have a whole day together where you're not getting any desk work done? And it's all about building bonds and spending time together and creating together. It's also about, I think, one of the other kind of symptoms of the pandemic is we're really quick to associate being productive with writing decks, emails, documents, moving through your to-do list. And actually, I actually think that before the pandemic, there was a better understanding that just random conversations at work are productive, right? So those kind of serendipitous chats about something that you're both working on that are seemingly unconnected are how you learn about your organization and the work that you're doing. So I think there's something to be said about encouraging more random conversations at work. And also thinking about what hybrid working means in terms of the beats of face-to-face time that you're putting in place at the beginning of a new project or initiative. So, for example, this is getting into more of a micro example, but when you kick off a project, you should always have a face-to-face kickoff. You need to be really explicit about what the expectations are for when you're going to be together face-to-face so that those opportunities don't slip away and you end up with some people calling in and some people in the office. So there's lots of different things. Also, like, it is about whole company meetings and whole company face-to-face time, but also it's about firing up and encouraging smaller communities of people in your organization to connect. So you need both.
You know, this is such a fascinating conversation. And it actually, what's interesting about you bringing this as a challenge is that two of the guests who are two recent episodes of Culture Crush have also focused on a similar area. And what that says to me is that this is it's an urgent area that needs to be addressed for business leaders and all organizations of all sizes. When Sheila Matthews was on the show, we talked about onboarding and how so many people start on day one and they're completely cut off. Nobody talks to them. They don't have enough structure in their diary.
Yeah.
You know, their manager's probably working remotely, so they don't, you know, you start on day one and you're like, what am I supposed to do now? And she talked about having a clear 30, 60, 90-day plan for how to address that challenge and do something differently about it. Then we had Lottie Unwin on the show, and she has just recently with Upworld, she's taken them from a remote working policy into a roaming working policy, where there is an expectation that you might have to come in for a few more meetings, or you might, for project kickoffs, have more face-to-face time to get those projects underway. What was interesting about that one is that she told me it was actually a very small change in policy, but it ended up with her being the number one trending topic on Reddit for 48 hours as hundreds, thousands of people yelled at her for forcing her people to come back to work. They completely misunderstood. So, you know, if you want a bit more context about that, please go and check out that episode. You mentioned that meeting virtually can sort of maintain connections, but it actually can't really build trust. And if you're leading projects, working with other people, that sense of trust is so essential. You also mentioned those kind of water cooler conversations that you know, those ad hoc moments. Those kind of conversations are so critical because it sort of allows the gray matter of your brain to like go to work a little bit. If you're in a meeting, especially if you're on a call like this one, you have an agenda, you have a plan. You know, you and I set questions before we hit record. You know, there's always this kind of rhythm and these points that you've got to hit. There isn't much room for wandering and exploring and allowing the kind of the subconscious ideas to kind of bubble up to the surface. So, you know, I totally get why this is such a critical challenge. You're not the first person to kind of highlight this, but, you know, it's great that we've got some practical starting points and practical ways to engage. And again, you know, really grounding this in some common sense language and ways for us to connect with it as an issue. Now, we are nearing the end of our time together. We are coming into land. But I know that you've also been thinking about some really practical ways for people to engage with this as a subject. And I'm wondering what the top takeaway, like what's the one thing, and it might be something we've already covered, or it might be something else that you want to really help people focus in on. But what's the one thing that people should take away and try when they're thinking about this challenge of building trust, moving away from virtual only, bringing people together in new ways? Like, what's the starting point that you want people to take away and try as soon as the episode finishes?
I think the thing to take away is think about where you're making assumptions about why people are behaving in the way that they do, and dig a little deeper and think more closely around your structures and processes of how your organisation works. So I think the most important thing is to start experimenting with different ways of working together and being really clear in your organisation about how and where you're trying different approaches and what the results have been. But something else I think is really important, particularly if you're someone running an organisation, is to think about that social connection lever and think about the impact that it actually has on things like innovation. So, for example, if you've got mid-level leaders who are dispersed, who are joining an organisation and spending a lot of time virtually talking to their colleagues, they're not getting to know one another. And the power of a cohort of leaders being a strong community and knowing one another is really huge for an organisation. But I think things like that can get forgotten. So it's not just about teams on the ground working together and how they are working in a hybrid environment. It's also thinking about the bigger picture in your organisation and where and how, if you invested in building trust, would that really accelerate what you're able to do?
Now, just as you were talking, I had one other question that's come up in my mind about assumptions versus questions. And when you're leading a project, when you're leading a team, it can be very challenging to leave your assumptions aside or check them at the door, because you don't necessarily know you're making assumptions, right? You know, you're bringing your experience into the conversation or into the project. You will have made some assumptions about what you're expecting from the person on the other side of the table. So I'm just wondering, how, as a leader, do you move from somebody who's making assumptions? How do you spot yourself making assumptions and bring yourself into that state and that stance of asking questions instead?
Talk to people, listen, try to land what you think that you're making an assumption around in terms of the ways of working of your organisation, and then start chatting to people, a really diverse mix of people. Don't just go to your leadership and ask for their views. I think, gosh, if Andas is anything like other organisations, which I know it is, we've got lots of people joining in their 20s whose beliefs and expectations around work differ hugely to us who are in our 40s. We've been around for much longer, and I think the culture is really different now, and we need to seek to understand, and we need to make sure we're putting in place what those people need to be in the environment where they're going to learn.
So I think that's a really kind of critical challenge, and we are coming into land now, but I think that's a really critical challenge for people. I would love people to ask themselves as they make their way through this Monday and through this week is, am I making assumptions or am I asking questions? Just begin to hold that thought in your mind. Like when you think about project challenges or workshops or meetings that you've got to have or projects that you're leading, are you asking questions that go up to the leadership, or are you asking questions that engage with people who are working for you or working alongside you? Just get more curious and see if you can break away from making too many assumptions. And I think what you'll find is really interesting feedback, new ways of working. You'll unearth bottlenecks that you didn't realize were there just by actually moving from that assumption mindset into that curiosity mindset. But Zoe, as I said, we are coming into land. And I want to say thank you for making some time for Culture Crush. It's been so great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please do your thing and like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a Culture First leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.